Today, as I said in the earlier posts, I'm going to be looking at the first biological law. The first biological law of, I guess, dis-ease, well-being, because I'm very passionate about sharing the message that our body is a biological system. It's a very wise and intelligent system. It has a lot of processes that are innate. We were born with them, that are designed to help us survive, to help us thrive. So they're designed to help us stay well. And if we go into dis-ease, to bring us back into balance, into harmony, into well-being. But there is a reason why we get sick. It's not random. It doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen because there's a mistake or something has gone wrong. It's actually a response. It's due to an adaptation that the body makes, but we'll be looking a little bit more at that as we go through. Just first of all to say that my passion is really to let you know that it isn't random, that it isn't a mistake, that something hasn't gone wrong. I think that we often receive that message from the society and the medical way in which we work in certainly the UK and probably a lot of the sort of Western world. But just to reassure you and to let you know that it's not something to be afraid of. It's not something to panic about. Your body isn't going wrong. It's not, as I used to think, letting you down. It's doing what it's designed to do. It's just that sometimes it's doing that from a place of maybe fear or trauma, and therefore the decisions are being made from that place and they aren't the ones that serve us best in the long run. However, the decisions that we make in the moment that maybe do come from fear, while they may not serve us long term, they serve us in that moment. So not to beat ourselves up, not to say we've done something we shouldn't have done, we've made a mistake, we've done something wrong, we've done something that hasn't served us. No. In that moment, that split-second moment when we made that decision, it was the best decision we could make with the resources we had access to. And it was right in that moment because it helped us survive. We're still here. And although long-term it might not serve us, I think it's important to recognize that at the moment we made that decision, at the moment we took that first course of action, it was the best one we could do. And to celebrate that because it did help us survive. We are still here. So to celebrate that, and even if we recognize now that it maybe wasn't made from our best self, our highest self, and it isn't serving us now, that's okay. We've recognized that, we've realized that, we can now take action to reframe it, to change it, to put something better in place. Better and more appropriate for where we are now. We are no longer where we were then. So let's dive on in and find out more about this first biological law. And it was discovered by, uncovered, not created, because obviously if it's a biological law, it's always been there. But maybe we just weren't aware of it. We hadn't realized it. So the first one maybe to recognize it was Dr. Hammer. He was a German doctor. And he did a lot of work around cancer and around dis-ease. And he discovered that there were 5 biological laws that the body follows. It's one of those laws that just are. Not laws that are created by human beings, but just facts. This is just how it works. Law of nature. And he discovered this through his own experience of getting cancer and healing from that cancer, and then also in his work with his patients. And he recognized that every dis-ease originates from an experience that we perceive as, and these aren't his words, these words came later from further explorations on his study, but that it's an experience that we perceive as unexpected, dramatic, isolating, and we have no coping strategy. So in the work that I do, we have created this acronym from these words, and we use the term a UDIN. And if you've been watching these lives, if you've seen them as replays, then you will know that I have spoken about UDINs before. If you haven't seen those and you'd like to know a bit more, just go to my YouTube channel and you will find the videos there. There's one actually specifically, I think, called UDIN. It's a short clip that I've taken from one of these longer pieces. So I'm not going to go into that in great depth here, but just to say that, as it says here, every dis-ease originates from something that we found unexpected, dramatic, isolating, and no coping strategy. Unexpected does not necessarily mean that we couldn't have foreseen it was going to happen. It means more that maybe our response to what happened was unexpected. So, for example, we may have known that somebody very close to us was ill and likely to die. But when they actually died, how it impacted on us was unexpected. The degree to which it impacted on us was unexpected. We may have thought, I know they're going to die, so perhaps it won't hit me in the same way had I not known, and it was a shock. And yes, that would have been a different kind of unexpected, but it's not to say that because we knew and could foresee that this was going to happen, that there wasn't an element of it that was unexpected. So just to clear that up. And in the other video, I also talk about other examples of UDINs and why we perceive them in that way. But again, just to state that a UDIN is very subjective. So two people in the same situation might have very different takes on that situation. Or in similar situations, I know somebody who was held up at gunpoint, and for her, it was not a UDIN because of where she was in herself, feeling very empowered, actually, at that point in time. She was in a car, she was at a stoplight, and somebody came and pointed a gun through the car window, and she drove off. So she took action. She got herself out of that situation. She just actually felt empowered by it. It was not a UDIN for her. Whereas for somebody else, being held up at gunpoint would be definitely a UDIN. It's very subjective. It depends so much on who we are, how we're feeling in that moment. Sometimes when we're feeling particularly at a low ebb, we're feeling vulnerable, then things that at other times we might not find to be unexpected, dramatic, isolating, and no coping strategy, actually in this particular moment do hit us very hard, and we do perceive them as a UDIN. Where it says isolating, that doesn't mean to say necessarily that we are physically alone on our own. It can mean things like, I couldn't talk to anybody about this. It feels too shameful, or nobody would understand. Again, because our perception of the moment, the situation, the event that happened is so personal, we might feel that nobody else would get it, and so we can't talk to them. And when it says no coping strategy, that may just mean that we didn't have access to a certain coping strategy in that moment. And that's not to say that we wouldn't have had a coping strategy in another situation. And the tutor who I learned this from, she had a particular UDIN that her normal coping strategy that she would have used in a situation like that was not accessible to her. So it wasn't that she didn't have a strategy at all. It was that in that particular situation, she didn't feel she could use her usual strategy. So just to bear those things in mind. As I was saying, it's very much about our personal perspective. It's very subjective. Two people in the same situation or experiencing something very similar to each other might not have the same response. One might have a UDIN, the other might not. Equally, two siblings growing up in the same household, and you might think they have the same experiences, they've had the same nurturing, the same upbringing, potentially they have the same-ish perspective. Even so, They may not respond in the same way. One could have a UDIN from a particular situation, the other might not. So it always to remember it's very subjective. So if you are somebody who has had a UDIN from a particular situation and you're looking around and the other people who were potentially with you in that situation seem not to have felt it as a traumatic event, that's perfectly natural, perfectly normal. It doesn't mean that you are weak in some way or that you are especially vulnerable. Perhaps you felt it at that time, but it's not a reflection on you. It's just what happened at that time. And if other people, sometimes they can judge us, and if you're left with a feeling that you're being judged, that people are thinking you're weak, or catch a grip, pull yourself together, why on earth did you find that traumatic? It was nothing. You don't have to take that on board. Please do understand, appreciate, give yourself permission to be you. If you find it traumatic, you find it traumatic. I think that certainly in my own experience, there were things where I pushed them down and that can't possibly have been traumatic. Other people have it so much worse. I remember I grew up in Belfast in the 70s. I was at primary school at that time. And it sounds terrible now, but we used to give money out of our pocket money to, it was called the black babies at that time, or the white babies. So maybe orphans or people who were less fortunate than ourselves. And so we used to get that message, other people have it so much worse than you. And things like, you must clear your plate because there are people starving in the world. Maybe we've all heard that one. So don't take that too much to heart. If you're thinking, yes, other people have it so much worse than me, and maybe it would appear that they do, but that's not to lessen your experience and any feelings of trauma or hurt or upset or whatever it is that you're feeling. You're feeling those things. They are legitimate. So remember, your perspective is what counts in regards to UDINs and how your body receives and perceives those. Nobody else is walking in your shoes. Nobody else can tell you that it's not a trauma if it is for you, or that you're wrong in some way in perceiving it as a trauma. No, it just is. That is your perception, and it is equally valid to anybody else's. And when that incident that we perceive as a UDIN, that we perceive as unexpected, dramatic, isolating, and we don't have access to any coping strategy, when it happens, that energy lands first of all in our heart. And I've shared before about how we have a head brain, a heart brain, and a gut brain. Our heart, they've done a lot of research in the Heart Math Institute in America, and they've discovered that there's more electromagnetic activity in our heart than there is in our brain, which just fries my brain, because you think of all the little synapses and chemicals and electronic connections that are firing away in the nerves of our brain, but there's less electromagnetic activity there than there is in the heart. And there is a field of electromagnetic activity, electromagnetic field around our heart that's measurable outside of our body. Isn't that just funky? Our bodies are so amazing when we start to look into them and all that they're doing for us every single day. So this energy of the UDIN, when it first comes, when we first perceive it, it's landing in our heart. And then milliseconds, almost immeasurably difference in time, it goes to the brain and to the relevant organ. And I've talked about this in some of those other videos before in terms of relevant organ and why and which organ would be relevant. But just to say here that we can get a sense of that in our language and in what we say. And I think that comes up a little bit later in another slide. but that will relate to the brain. So you can see in this diagram here that there are different parts of our brain. And in metaconsciousness, which is the work that I do, we look at 4 to 5 layers of the brain. And when we have an embryo, I discussed this in one of the other videos in more depth, but that fertilized egg that goes on to become the embryo, that goes on to become the baby, initially it's just cells multiplying. But then it gets to a point where it starts to form layers, and it forms 3 layers: the mesoderm, endoderm, and the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. The endoderm goes towards being the more primitive part of our brain, the brain stem, and also the digestive and reproductive organs in our body. And it's all about survival. So if there's any UDIN that we perceive as being a survival issue, a life and death issue, it will land when it gets sent from the heart to the organs and the brain. It will land in the brainstem, and it'll land in one of the organs. And if we listen to our language, we can say things like, I could not stomach that, or I find that really difficult to swallow, or I just couldn't digest it. And that's giving us a clue as to which organ it's landing in our body. So there's the brainstem, the midbrain, the cerebellum, cerebral medulla, and the cortex. The 4 to 5 different layers in the brain. And each one of those layers has like a different theme or a different meaning, which when we start to unpack things, we can use that as information, as wisdom to support us and to support us in getting back to well-being. And then each organ, and sometimes even further down to the layer of the tissue, will give us further information. And that's what I'm summarizing here. And you can see 4 of the layers. The midbrain is kind of like a mezzanine. It's kind of a halfway. It's sometimes seen as a layer in its own right, and more so now. But initially, back in Hammer's time, when he was first formulating this, he didn't consider the midbrain. It didn't really appear at all. So focusing just on the main 4 here, as I said, there's the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. And the mesoderm can be divided into the old mesoderm and the new mesoderm, going from left to right, from the paler color through to the darker green. It's endoderm, brainstem, cerebellum, old mesoderm, cerebral medulla, new mesoderm, and then the cerebral cortex, which is the ectoderm. And you can also see a brief summary of the different themes of each of those layers. As I said, the brainstem, basic survival, eating, reproducing, excreting, and digestion. The cerebellum is about protection, and we often see that in the body in terms of the envelope or sac in which some of the organs are held. So the heart has the pericardium, the lungs have the pleura, that sort of thing. The dermis as well, so the underlayer of our skin, the deeper layer of our skin, those all come under the cerebellum, and they're about protection. The cerebral medulla, excuse me, is about stability and performance. And here we see our muscular skeletal system and our connective tissues, ligaments, tendons, fascia. They all come under the cerebral medulla. The cerebral cortex, for us as mammals and humans, we are later on the evolutionary tree, shall we say. And our cerebral cortex tends to be, it's a higher proportion of our brain volume. And it's also more crinkled and wrinkled, so it has a greater surface area. And this is kind of reflected in the meaning, the theme of this layer, because it's often around our communication and hierarchy, our identity. It's also to do with our senses and how we take in information from the world around us. So sight, hearing, smell, taste, feel, because if you think of your skin, the outer layer of your skin, that's the actual part that contacts with the world around us. So here it can largely be to do with identity and separation and social interaction. But not only is this in the body, you will see changes, adaptations from the UDIN in the particular tissue that the UDIN lands in. So you'll see changes in the body, adaptations taking place. We'll potentially have symptoms in those tissues and organs, but you'll also see it in the brain. If you have a CT scan done, and it needs to be at a very particular angle as to how that then shows up in the brain, how you can see that in the brain, it looks like this. It looks like a set of concentric rings. And when the conflict, as we often call it, or the UDIN, is fresh and new and active, it's very much like this. So it's sharp and it's clear, and you can see those concentric rings. As we begin to go from the conflict being active into the conflict starting to resolve and to heal, again, watch my other videos for further information on that, the process of the disease itself. But when it starts to heal, body will be changing. We may get symptoms as the body starts to detox and work back towards balance and well-being. But in the brain, those concentric circles start to go fuzzy. They start to lose their sharpness and definition. So if somebody is skilled on reading X-rays of the brain, they can see where the conflict shock has landed, which layer, and also whether it's active or it's in regeneration. And this is a couple of examples of that, where you can see the concentric rings. Hopefully you can see them on your screen, that they're clear enough for the size of the image that you've got. The red arrow obviously is trying to help you to locate those. But the ones on the left-hand side, the slightly bigger image, they are sharp. So that conflict is still active for that person. The one on the right, you can see where the lines are, the line is broader, but it's less sharp. So it's kind of like spreading out, diffusing a little bit. That is a person who has gone into regeneration. And so the conflict shock is starting to fade away as they have resolved it and they're processing and moving back to well-being. And just to give an example of how this might play out in another mammal, I'm going to talk here about a big cat, because if they're out in the wild and they're having to survive on their own body resources and just from the things that their body can do for them, the processes that they have innately within them. Supposing a lion has made a kill, probably not this lion because it's generally the lionesses, but hey. So the lion is eating its meal. It's a leg or whatever, and it has bone within that. And sometimes the lion might swallow maybe a knuckle or a part of that bone that's too big, and it can get stuck in the stomach. So here you can see a stomach, and down at the bottom where there's that little valve that determines how things move through the stomach and down further on into the intestines, I've stuck in a little lump of bone there. So you can see how it's kind of got itself where it's too big, it can't go through that valve. And so if that stayed stuck, if it actually got stuck and it wasn't just kind of rolling around and in there occasionally and then falling back out again, if it gets stuck in that valve, then the lion is going to die, because it needs the throughput. It needs the food to be able to go on down. And if it got stuck in there, even if the lion was sick, that bone potentially could stay wedged in there, in that valve, and then it's going to have a buildup of gas in its stomach. It's going to be very uncomfortable, very unwell, but that, which could lead to death. But of course, the animal is wanting to survive. Its whole body, its whole system is geared for survival. So what it does is it secretes extra acid and whatever gastric juices it can to break down that bone so that it goes into a smaller piece and it can move on through. And then the lion survives. So the body is responding to the challenge that it feels it's facing. And here, if you remember, this would be under the brain stem because it's all about survival, it's all about digestion. And in that relay, in those tissues, the conflict, as we call it, is a morsel conflict. It's another way of describing it in that in the brainstem and brainstem tissues, because it's like that little chunk, that chunk of bone, that morsel of bone, or whatever it might be, that's got stuck, and we're struggling to enable that to move on through. And if you know in a little bit more detail about the anatomy of the digestive system, there are a lot of little villi in there that are designed to move things through and to digest and absorb. So the digestive system is all about that throughput. It goes in one end, it goes all the way through, it gets broken down. We are able to digest and absorb, hopefully get those nutrients, and then it goes on down and comes out the other end. And that's what it's designed to do. But if there's a problem, it's generally because there's a morsel that gets stuck. It's not moving on through as it's designed to do. This is all I've been talking about food, literal food, and that digestive process. But as human beings, we also see information in the same way as we see food. We're very metaphorical beings. So let me just check. That's not, sorry. Just wanted to check the next slide. We say things like, I bit off more than I could chew. I couldn't stomach it, as I said earlier. I couldn't digest that information. And I couldn't let it go. So sometimes when we get constipated, it's because there's something that we're still holding on to. We're struggling to digest it, to assimilate it. So we hang on to it for longer. And that was what was happening to me when I had IBS years ago. Something had happened in my life, which I talk about in the other videos, I think, and certainly in my book, which I could not digest. I couldn't assimilate that particular morsel of an event, a time, an piece of information that I'd been given. So my body was desperately trying to work through it. And I had IBS. We may also think of things like, I just couldn't get my head around it. I couldn't face it. Whatever different phrases you might hear others saying, as soon as you start to look at things this way, you start to pick up on these little phrases and things that people say, things that are in our language. Obviously, English may have its particular ones. There may be other ones in different cultures, different countries, different perceptions, different ways that we look at things and express things. So this might be, as I was saying, rather than the literal of there's a bone stuck, what about when I just couldn't digest it? I couldn't understand. I couldn't stomach it. I couldn't work it through. It was a morsel that was getting stuck metaphorically in my system because I couldn't break it down. I couldn't digest it. I couldn't assimilate it. That's what I'm representing with this slide here. So not only does this process, this biological process, work literally, so like a fragment of bone getting stuck, it can also work metaphorically. particularly for us humans. Maybe less so for other animals, but certainly for us humans, it does. Another set of phrases that you might hear are things like, I didn't want to see, I didn't want to hear. So that's represented here. And that can impact on those organs. Didn't want to see, it'll affect our eyes. Didn't want to hear, it'll affect our ears. So as I'm saying, whatever tissue, whatever brain relay, after going to the heart, when it's sent to the brain relay and the tissue, whatever ones are affected, they will be significant. If we didn't want to see something, it'll go to the eyes. So that'll be in something like the cortex, because that's our senses and it includes our sight, or hearing, if I didn't want to hear something. So this is an example of a UDIN where parents are arguing, and it's also an example of a trauma that may be a cumulative, ongoing trauma, not just maybe a one-off argument between mum and dad, but it might be a regular occurrence. And this child is just, I don't want to see it, I don't want to hear it, I don't want my parents to be arguing. And so their body could respond, particularly if it is ongoing and if the parents aren't able to then make up, reassure the child, let the child know that all is well and that they are not at risk. Because sometimes as a child, we might think, if mum and dad are arguing, what does that mean for me? If they split up, where do I go? What happens to me? Will I survive? Will I be outcast? Who's going to want me? Those sorts of things. A child can feel very vulnerable and very threatened in that kind of situation. So they really might not want to see or hear what's going on all sorts of levels, and it can affect their well-being. But the reason why our body does this, the reason why our body responds and why we experience symptoms and issues in our body is so that we become aware. Our symptoms are information. There's a great quote by A.H. Almaas, which I've shared before, but basically he's talking about our conflicts. He talks about our pain, our discomfort, the issues that we're experiencing are ours. They are very much unique to us, but they are the part of us that loves us the most. So it's kind of like your body. It's where you live. It's your home. It wants to nurture you and nourish you and support you and protect you and ensure your survival. It loves you. And also there's the spiritual element of that as well. But just to say that that part of you that loves you the most, the only language it has is how you feel, whether that's physically, emotionally, psychologically. And that's what it uses to talk to you, to communicate with you, to draw your attention to issues and challenges and bits of your life maybe that aren't working as well as they could, because it wants better for you. It wants you to see, it wants you to learn, it wants to share wisdom with you. And the only way it has to draw your attention is by how you feel. So when our bodies aren't feeling well, it is okay. It's just an invitation. Your body is just saying, let's have a chat. I've got some stuff to share with you because I love you, because I want to support you. I want to help you survive. I want to help you thrive. And as humans, we are fortunate in that we can think metaphorically, we can think the bigger picture, the outer kind of, we can step back, we can take that epi perspective, that meta perspective, and we can kind of have a deeper, more profound understanding of what's going on. So the child might be anxious and scared and develop issues because of that. But the ultimate aim of the logical, biological, natural process is that we learn, that we grow, that our symptoms give us the wisdom and the information that they have to share with us, which is about who we really are, who we were born to be. And the more we can listen and take that on board and allow it to teach us and guide us, the more we can grow and step more fully into that fullest potential of who we really are. And that's what this process is all about. And I think it's so important, therefore, to find ways to listen, to find ways to respond consciously to what our body is sharing. So often, I think, particularly if we've had experience of trauma and we haven't learnt ways of navigating that support us, we haven't had maybe external support and help to help us make sense of what happened, we can get stuck in those repeating patterns. And I think also society conditions us often to stay stuck, even to just push on through, to keep busy, to keep distracted, rather than giving ourselves permission to take the space, take the time, engage in radical, deep self-care, listening to our bodies, allowing them to guide us rather than the external world. And the external world has a lot to share. It has a lot of learning. It has a lot of information. But we need to be able to assess, is that right for me? Because that information comes from outside of us. It comes from somebody else. If it's been there a long time, perhaps it's not relevant to me in my time, in my situation. It may have been relevant then, but is it relevant now? If it comes from somebody in another location, is it relevant for that location and not for mine, my situation, my experience? So I think it's always really valuable and important to go to our own wisdom. We may like to get information from outside because it can help us to gauge where we are. It can be interesting to explore and to weigh up against, how does this feel for me? Does it feel right? Does it feel wrong? Does it help me to expand on what I have from within my own information and wisdom? But ultimately, the decisions and choices we make, I think, need to be made within, for ourselves, from our own inner guidance, rather than being too swayed from what comes from outside. And if you're interested in learning more about this, you'd like to know more about these different brain relays and how they relate to different tissues in our body, and how do we unpack the symptoms that we're experiencing, and does this cover all symptoms? Is there anything that's outside of this or that doesn't come under this law? And how can I read what's going on in my own body? How can I dialogue with my own body and access that wisdom? Then I highly recommend you join me for this workshop. It's going to be taking place here in Southeast Wales, if you're able to travel here. And the next time I'll be running it is October, from Friday the 11th to Sunday the 13th of October, from 10 till 4 every day here at Wellbeing, which is near to Abergavenny, if you know the area. I don't offer places to stay here, but there are lots to stay in Abergavenny and the surrounding areas. We are just inside of the Brecon Beacons. So that's kind of why I've made the days 10 till 4. It gives you time to travel in should you need it. And also it finishes early-ish in the day, because I want to give you that opportunity to take advantage of the amazing place in which we live and the nature around us. There are lots of walks that you can do around here, or just to be able to sit and take that time of stillness, take that time of quiet to process and to really work through all that I will be teaching and sharing. It's a 3-day workshop. The first 2 days are sharing information, giving you access to all of this learning. And then in the 3rd day, we put it into practice. So if you did want to come along, I send out a workshop questionnaire where I ask you, is there something that you specifically would like to explore? on the third day of the workshop so that we can start putting things into practice to support your learning. Maybe you have a condition that you want to know more about. Maybe you've had an illness you want to know more about, or someone in your family, or just something you've read about and wondered, what is it that causes that particular condition? Just fill that in on that pre-questionnaire and we will look at it on the third day. If you are not free on those dates or not able to travel, maybe Wales is nowhere near where you live, I also offer this as an online program. It's self-study modules interspersed with Zoom calls with me to check in, make sure that everything's going smoothly, you're understanding the information, and that you're able to start to put it into practice. There's also an opportunity for you to do that similar to this one towards the end of the program, really put things into practice and maybe do a case study and share that with me. So if you're interested, you can find this on my website. So that's equenergy.com. If you go to the furthest right tab, it says shop, hover over that and you get a drop-down menu. The first option on the drop-down menu is events. So click on that and you'll see the next date there listed on that. It's a set of tiles and you can find Unlocking Healing Wisdom there. Or if you just want to ask some questions, do please feel free to get in touch with me. Either post below, contact me directly, DM me, whatever works for you. I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have. Also, just to say in terms of what I provide, I offer teas, coffees and biscuits, but I don't provide meals. So again, there are loads of places around Abergavenny where you can buy a packed lunch or whatever to bring with you on the day or on the days. So that's the workshop if you'd like to know more. And if you want to access my website and go to the events page, then that's the QR or the direct URL. So feel free to just scan that and that will take you straight to the page. Any problems with that, just let me know. Also, if you're interested in knowing more about these things, I do talk about in my book the 5 biological laws. So that's another opportunity, another avenue which you can use to explore further if you would like to. My book is available through my website. You can either go to the My Book tab or to the shop, and it's available on Amazon as well. So through me on my website, you can get it as a paperback and you can opt for having it signed as well if you'd like that personal touch. Through Amazon, you can also get it as a Kindle version. And I'm hoping to shortly-ish in the next month or two to also have it uploaded as an audiobook. So that'll just depend. I'm recording it myself. It'll depend on how well that goes. But fingers crossed, I'll have it up there shortly. And it's available through Waterstones online as well. So lots of options there depending on which type you would like to have. And if you want to buy it through my website, which if you go onto this URL or scan this QR code on my website, it does give you the Amazon option and the Waterstones option as well. So feel free to scan that, whichever version you would like. If you would like to connect with me and maybe you have some questions, you'd like to discuss your own situation or just have a chat about anything, but particularly about well-being stuff. I always like to connect with people. And as you can probably tell, I love chatting about well-being stuff. Then this is the way to do that. If you go to this URL, it takes you to my calendar and you can find a day and a time. As soon as you click on that, it'll just help you to book in for a Zoom call. It'll send you a link and confirm the date and time. So that is the end of the presentation for today. And on the next session, I'm going to be looking at the second biological law, and then I'm going to go through all 5 over the next set of Let's Talk Wellbeing sessions. So As I say, I hope you've enjoyed today. Please do feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions, any comments. I would love to hear from you. And other than that, I just wish you a great rest of your day. And if you're watching the live, have a wonderful weekend. Bye for now.